The Great Galactic War had lasted longer than most civilizations could remember. For 70,000 years, the stars had been a place of fire and death. Thousands of alien races had risen to power and fallen into dust during this time. The two main sides, the Krell Empire and the Zarn Coalition, had fought over every rock and moon in the galaxy. They had used weapons that could crack planets, but neither side could ever truly win. The galaxy was tired. The resources were running out. Still, the Connors of Lead killing did not stop. It was a war of habit, a cycle of hate that no one knew how to break. Far away from the main battle zones, on a small blue planet called Earth, humans were watching. For a long time, humanity was considered too primitive to join the Provocaine galactic stage. The Krell and the Zarn ignored Earth because it had no special minerals and its people were busy fighting each other. But while the galaxy was busy, destroying itself, humans were learning. They were studying the debris that floated into their solar system from distant battles. They were picking up radio signals and light flashes from thousands of light years away. They realized that the galaxy was a dangerous place, and if they wanted to survive, they needed to be faster, stronger, and smarter than anyone else. Commander John Miller stood on the bridge of the USS Stardestroyer. He was a man of few words, with gray hair and eyes that looked like they had seen too much. The ship beneath his feet was the result of 1,000 years of secret human development. It wasn't just a ship, it was a miracle of engineering. While the aliens focused on bigger lasers and thicker shields, humans had focused on something different, the fabric of space and time itself. The Stardestroyer was the first of its kind, a vessel that didn't just travel through space but existed outside of it, when it wanted to. It was silent, invisible, and incredibly deadly. The mission was simple but terrifying. Humanity had decided that the 70,000-year war had to end. It was not just about peace. It was about survival. If the Krell or the Zarn finally won, they would eventually turn their eyes toward Earth. The fine humans chose to strike first, not to conquer, but to stop the fighting forever. The target was the Sector 7G, where the largest fleet in history had gathered for a final, massive battle. Millions of ships were ready to tear each other apart. The humans intended to be the third party that no one saw coming. Miller looked at his crew. They were young men and women who had grown up in a world where the alien war was a ghost story told to children. Now, they were the ones who would face the ghosts. "Initialize the fold drive," Miller said quietly. The voice didn't shake. The bridge hummed with a low, deep sound that vibrated in the bones of everyone on board. On the main view screen, the stars didn't stretch like they did in old movies. They simply vanished, replaced by a strange, swirling gray mist. They were no longer in the universe they knew. They were in the in-between. In the 7G sector, the Krell Admiral, Varkas, was laughing. He sat in his throne on a ship the size of a city. He had 5 million ships under his command. Across the void, the Zarn leader had just as many. Varkas was sure that today would be the day. He finally broke the Zarn. He didn't care about the cost. He didn't care about the cost. Millions of soldiers who would die in the next hour. He only cared about the glory of the Krell Empire. He gave the order to charge. The space between the two fleets began to glow with the light of millions of engines and charging weapons. Suddenly, a sensor alarm went off on Varkas's bridge. It was a sound he had never heard before. It wasn't a warning of an incoming missile or a laser lock. It was a warning that the physics of the area were changing. "Report," Varkas barked. His officers scrambled, their many hands moving over glowing consoles. "Admiral, something is appearing in the dead zone between us and the enemy," one officer shouted. "It's not a ship. It's a hole in space." From that hole, the USS Stardestroyer emerged. It looked tiny compared to the massive alien dreadnoughts. It was sleek, black, and didn't have any visible guns. To the aliens, it looked like a toy. Varkas laughed again. "Is this a joke? Have the Zarn sent a scout ship to beg for mercy?" He ordered his nearest ships to destroy the intruder, but the lasers didn't hit. The missiles didn't explode. Everything fired at the down. USS Stardestroyer simply passed through it, as if the ship were a ghost. On the description, bridge of the human ship, Miller checked his watch. The 50-minute countdown had begun. The humans didn't fire back. Instead, they released thousands of small, silver spheres. These spheres didn't move toward the ships. They moved toward the very stars and planets in the sector. The Krell and Zarn were so focused on each other that they barely noticed. They were still trying to understand why their weapons were failing against the black ship. 50 minutes, Miller whispered to himself. In 50 minutes, the history of the galaxy changes forever. The spheres began to pulse with a blue light. This light wasn't bright, but it was felt. It was a frequency that disrupted the very technology the aliens had used for 70 millennia. Slowly, the massive engines of the Krell fleet began to flicker. The shields of the Zarn ships began to drop. Communication lines went silent. Panic began to spread through the alien ranks. They had been fighting for so long that they didn't know how to handle a situation where their machines just stopped working. The USS Stardestroyer sat in the middle of it all, a silent judge watching a massive, broken world. Miller watched the readings. Everything was going according to plan. The aliens thought they were the masters of the universe because they had big guns. They didn't realize that the universe had rules, and humans had learned how to rewrite those rules. This wasn't a battle of strength. It was a battle of knowledge. The giant 70,000-year war was about to meet a force it couldn't understand, and the clock was ticking down, second by second, toward the end of an era. 10 minutes had passed since the USS Stardestroyer arrived. The initial laughter of the Krell and Zarn leaders had turned into a cold, biting fear. Admiral Varkas stared at his screens, which were now filled with static and error messages. His massive city ship, the Pride of Krell, was drifting. It wasn't damaged by fire, but it was losing its will to live. The lights were dimming, and the artificial gravity was starting to wobble. He looked out the window and saw his mighty fleet in total chaos. Ships were bumping into each other like blind animals in a dark room. On the Zarn side, things were even worse. The Zarn were a collective species, their minds linked by a biological radio. The silver spheres released by the humans were emitting a signal that jammed this link. For the first time in their history, individual Zarn were feeling alone. The psychic pain of being cut off from the group was causing thousands of pilots to freeze in terror. Their formations broke apart. The terrifying war machine of the Zarn coalition was falling into a state of madness. They weren't even thinking about the enemy anymore. They were just trying to remember who they were. Inside the USS Stardestroyer, the atmosphere was calm. There were no flashing red lights or screaming officers. The bridge was cool and quiet. Commander Miller sat in his chair, watching the data flow. Phase 2, he said. His tactical officer, Sarah, nodded. She pressed a series of buttons on her glass console. Deploying the message probes now, sir. Across the sector, the silver spheres changed their grape behavior. Instead of just jamming signals, they began to project images into the minds and onto the screens of every living soul in both fleets. The images weren't of weapons or threats. They were images of the 70,000-year war. The spheres showed the destruction of thousands of worlds. They showed the billions of lives lost. They showed the faces of children from 100 different races who had never known a day of peace. The humans had used their advanced technology to pull these memories from the very history of the galaxy. It was a mirror. The humans were forcing the Krell and the Zarn to look at what they had become. They were showing them that their war had no purpose anymore. It was just a machine that ate lives. Varkas watched the images on his flickering screen. He saw the face of a Zarn, child crying over a destroyed home, and for a second, he felt a strange emotion. He had always been told the Zarn were monsters, but the child looked just like a Krell, child in pain. He tried to look away, but the images were everywhere. They were in his head. The USS Stardestroyer was using a form of neural projection that humans had perfected to cure mental illness on Earth. Here, they were using it to cure the galaxy of its obsession with war. 20 minutes were gone. The battlefield was now silent. No more lasers were fired. No more missiles were launched. The two greatest fleets in history were just floating in the void, surrounded by the ghosts of their own victims. The silver spheres continued to pulse, weaving a web of peace through the chaos. On the human ship, the crew felt the weight of what they were doing. They weren't just soldiers. They were surgeons, performing a dangerous operation on a dying patient. One wrong move and the galaxy would bleed out. "Sir, the Krell flagship is attempting to use a manual backup weapon," Sarah reported. Miller frowned. Even in the face of such truth, some would still choose violence. "Target their weapon systems with the graviton beam," Miller ordered. "Don't destroy them. Just disable." A thin, invisible beam shot out from the Stardestroyer. It didn't explode. It simply increased the gravity around the Krell's main gun by 1,000 times. The massive metal barrel groaned, and then collapsed under its own weight, folding like a piece of paper. The Krell crew watched, in horror as their ultimate weapon was crushed by nothing at all. The message was clear. Humanity was not here to play games. They were the masters of forces the aliens hadn't even dreamed of. The Stardestroyer was showing that it could end any life in the sector with a thought, yet it chose not to. This restraint was more terrifying to the alien leaders than 1,000 bombs. It was a display of power combined with a morality they didn't understand. Why save your enemy? Why not just kill them all and take the galaxy for yourself? These were the questions filling Varkus's mind. 30 minutes had passed. The mirror phase was ending. The alien soldiers were no longer angry. They were exhausted. The weight of 70,000 years of guilt was heavy. The spheres began to change their signal again. This time, they started transmitting coordinates. They weren't coordinates for a base or a trap. They were coordinates for a neutral planet, a place where the leaders of both sides could meet. The silence that followed Miller's speech was heavier than any sound of battle. Across millions of ships, soldiers and officers looked at each other. The words, "The war ends today," echoed in their minds. For most of them, war was all they knew. Their grandfathers had fought. Their great-grandfathers had died in it. A universe without war was as hard to imagine as a universe without stars. In the Krell flagship, Admiral Varkus gripped the arms of his throne. His pride was screaming at him to fight, to die with honor. But he looked at his crew. They were looking at him with eyes full of hope that they might actually survive the day. On the USS Stardestroyer, the tension was rising. 40 minutes mark, Sarah whispered. "No response from either flagship yet, sir?" Miller nodded. He knew this would be the hardest part. Giving up a habit of 70,000 years wasn't easy. It required a leap of faith that most politicians weren't capable of. "Prepare the peacemaker pulse," Miller said. This was the final option. If they didn't agree, the Stardestroyer would emit a wave that would permanently fuse every weapon trigger in the sector. It would render the fleets harmless, but it was a forceful move. Miller hoped it wouldn't come to that. Suddenly, a light blinked on the communications board. "Sir, it's the Zarn Coalition," Sarah shouted, her voice filled with excitement. They are, signaling a surrender, not to the Krell, but to us. They say their collective mind is in agreement. They cannot continue the cycle of pain." A cheer almost broke out on the human bridge, but Miller held up a hand. One side was not enough. If the Krell didn't agree, they would simply slaughter the defenseless Zarn. "Connect me to the Krell Admiral," Miller commanded. Direct line. The screen flickered, and the face of Admiral Varkus appeared. He looked ancient. His skin was a deep purple, and his many eyes were bloodshot. "Human," Varkus said, his voice raspy. "You speak of peace as if it is a simple thing. If I lay down my arms, my empire will call me a coward. They will execute me, and send another to finish what I started. Miller looked the alien straight in the eyes. "Admiral, there will be no one to execute you. We are not just talking to you. We are talking to your whole empire. Our spheres are transmitting to your home worlds right now. Your people are seeing what you see. They are tired, Varkas. Just as tired as you are." Varkas looked away from the camera. He looked at a secondary screen showing a live feed from the Krell capital planet. He saw crowds of people in the streets, not shouting for blood, but weeping as they watched the images of the war's true cost. The human technology had bypassed all the government filters. The truth was out, and it was more powerful than any propaganda. Varkas realized that Miller was right. The empire he served had changed in the last 30 minutes. The war was no longer supported by the people who paid for it in blood. 45 minutes, Sarah announced. Only 5 minutes remained. The Zarn ships had already powered down their engines and were waiting. The Krell fleet remained in a state of high alert. Their weapons still aimed at the Zarn and the human ship. Miller waited. He didn't pressure Varkas. He knew that for a warrior like the Admiral, this was a death of a different kind. It was the death of an identity. Varkas looked back at Miller. "What happens if we stop? What does a galaxy without war look like?" Miller smiled slightly. "It looks like progress, Admiral. It looks like trade, and art, and exploring the unknown without fear. We have been waiting for you to join us. The universe is a big place. There is enough room for everyone if you stop trying to own all of it." Varkas let out a long, shuddering breath. He reached forward and tapped a command on his desk. Across the sector, the Krell ships began to turn away. Their weapon lights faded into a dull red, then turned off completely. "The Krell Empire accepts the ceasefire," Varkas said, sounding like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. A massive roar of celebration finally broke out on the USS Stardestroyer. People were hugging and crying. They had done it. They had ended the longest war in history in less than an hour. Miller felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he stayed focused. "Keep the spheres active," he ordered. "We need to guide them to the negotiation site. This is just the beginning." He looked at the timer. It was at 49 minutes and 50 seconds. 10 seconds later, it hit 0. The war was officially over as the USS Stardestroyer began to move, leading the two massive fleets toward a new future. Miller looked out at the stars. They seemed brighter now, as if the smoke of 70,000 years had finally cleared. Humanity had entered the galactic stage not as conquerors, but as the adults in the room. They had used their power to save their neighbors from themselves. It was a proud day for Earth. But Miller knew the real work of building a peaceful galaxy was only just beginning. "Course set for the neutral zone," Sarah reported, her face beaming. "Let's go make some history," Miller replied. The journey to the neutral zone was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Two massive fleets, which only an hour ago were ready to erase each other from existence, were now flying side by side in a long, silent line. In the middle, like a shepherd leading a flock of giants, was the USS Stardestroyer. To any observer, it looked impossible. The Krell and the Zarn pilots were still nervous, their hands hovering near controls, but the human ship's presence acted as a calming force. If anyone even thought about firing, the Stardestroyer would know. Its sensors were tuned to the very electrical impulses of the alien computers. On Earth, the news was being met with a mix of shock and celebration. The secret, Project End War, had been successful beyond anyone's dreams. For centuries, humans had prepared for this moment, building their technology in the shadows of their own moon and deep within the asteroid belt. They had known that showing themselves too early would make them targets. They had to wait until they were so advanced that they couldn't be stopped. Now, the world was watching the live feed from the Stardestroyer. Every human on the planet felt a sense of pride. They weren't just a small planet anymore. They were the guardians of the galaxy. As they reached the neutral planet, a lush green world called Unity by the starter, humans, the landing process began. This was the first time Krell, Zarn, and humans would stand on the same ground. Miller prepared to leave the ship. He didn't take a squad of soldiers. He took 2 diplomats and a scientist. He wanted to show that the age of the soldier was being replaced by the age of the thinker. As the human shuttle descended, they could see the alien ships landing in the distance. The scale was massive. It looked like a forest made of metal and fire. The meeting took place in a large open valley. The humans had used quick-build technology to set up a massive transparent dome. Inside, the air was filtered to be comfortable for all 3 species. Admiral Varkas was the first to arrive from the alien side. He walked slowly, his heavy boots thumping on the grass. He was followed by the Zarn Prime, a tall, thin creature with shimmering skin that changed color with its emotions. Right now, the Zarn Prime was a soft, pale blue, the color of peace. They met in the center of the dome, where Miller was waiting. Varkas looked around at the grass and the trees. He hadn't stood on a planet in 20 years. He had spent his life on metal decks and inside cockpit seats. He reached down and touched a leaf, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle. "I had forgotten," he said, not to anyone in particular. "I had forgotten what we were fighting for. We were fighting for land, but we stayed in the sky so long we forgot what land felt like." The Zarn Prime nodded, its shimmering skin turning a slightly deeper blue. "The collective remembers the green," the Zarn said, its voice sounding like many voices speaking at once. "But the green was always covered in the red of blood. Today, it is just green." Miller stepped forward. "Welcome to Unity," he said. "Today we don't talk about borders. We don't talk about who owes what to whom. We talk about the future. We have 70,000 years of history to move past. It won't happen today, and it won't happen tomorrow. But the fact that we are all standing here without killing each other is a miracle." He gestured to a large table in the center of the room. On it were maps of the galaxy, but they were different. They didn't show empire, territories. They showed resource points, scientific anomalies, and trade routes. The discussion was long and difficult. Old habits died hard. Varkas would occasionally argue about a specific mining moon, and the Zarn Prime would complain about historical insults. But every time the tension rose, Miller would remind them of the spheres. He would remind them of the images of the children. He acted as a mediator, a role humanity had practiced for centuries during its own internal conflicts. Humans were experts at settling fights because they had spent so much of their history fighting. They knew every trick, every lie, and every excuse. They used this knowledge to cut through the alien politics. By the end of the first day, a basic framework was reached. It was called the Galactic Accord. It wasn't a treaty of friendship that would take time, but it was a treaty of non-interference. They agreed to pull back their fleets and create a wide peace zone between their empires. This zone would be patrolled by the humans. Both the Krell and the Zarn accepted this, mostly because they knew they couldn't stop the humans if they tried. The USS Stardestroyer was still hovering in orbit, a silent reminder of what happened to those who broke the peace. As the sun set over the valley, Miller and Varkas stood together outside the dome. "You have changed everything," Varkas said, looking up at the sky where the Stardestroyer was visible as a bright star. "The galaxy will never be the same. Some will hate you for this. Some will think you are gods. Others will think you are tyrants." Miller looked at the horizon. "We aren't gods, Admiral. We're just people who got tired of watching a tragedy. If they think we are tyrants because we stopped the killing, then we can live with that. But I think, in time, they will just see us as friends. They haven't met yet." Varkas let out a sound that might have been a laugh. Friends. A strange word for a Krell to hear. But perhaps it is time for new words. He offered a hand. A gesture he had learned from watching the human broadcasts. Miller took it and shook it firmly. It was the first handshake of the new era. In the background, the Zarn Prime watched, its skin glowing with a bright, vibrant gold. The war had ended in 50 minutes, but the peace was something they would have to build every single day from now on. The USS Stardestroyer had done its job, and for the first time in 70,000 years, the galaxy was quiet. 1 year had passed since the day the 70,000-year war ended. The galaxy was a very different place. The peace zone, patrolled by the humans, had become the busiest area of space. It was no longer a place of fear, but a place of meeting. Huge space stations were being built where Krell merchants traded their minerals for Zarn technology, all under the watchful eyes of human peacekeepers. The USS Stardestroyer was no longer alone. It was the flagship of a new fleet, called the Galactic Guardians. This fleet was made of ships from all three species, working together to keep the peace. On the planet Earth, things had changed too. Humans were no longer hiding. They had become the teachers of the galaxy. Human universities were now full of alien students, eager to learn about Earth's history, philosophy, and, most importantly, its technology. Humans didn't keep their secrets to themselves. They shared the technology that had stopped the war, showing the aliens how to create energy without destroying planets, and how to heal diseases that had plagued them for millennia. By sharing their power, humanity made sure that no one would ever need to fight for resources again. Commander Miller was now Admiral Miller. He sat in his new office on the Unity space station, which orbited the planet where the first peace talks had happened. He was looking at a report from a distant sector. A small conflict had broken out between two minor races who were trying to copy the old Krell ways. He didn't need to send a fleet. He just sent a single message from the Stardestroyer, reminding them of the accord. The conflict stopped instantly. The reputation of the humans was enough to prevent wars before they even started. Varkas, now a retired diplomat instead of an admiral, walked into Miller's office. He walked with a cane now, but he looked happier than Miller had ever seen him. The Zarn Prime is complaining again, Varkas said with a grin. Something about the trade taxes on the Nebula route. Miller laughed and leaned back in his chair. I'll take a Zarn complaining about taxes over a Zarn firing plasma cannons any day of the week. Varkas nodded in agreement. It is strange, Miller. I spent my whole life thinking the end of the war would be a grand explosion. I never thought it would be a series of meetings about taxes and shipping lanes. The two old warriors looked out the window at the view of the station. They saw ships of all shapes and sizes docking and departing. They saw a Krell family walking, with a human guide, looking at the stars with wonder instead of fear. This was the world the USS Stardestroyer had created in just 50 minutes. It was a world that was still messy and complicated, but it was a world that was alive. The 70,000 years of death were finally over, replaced by a future that belonged to everyone. Humanity had stepped into the light, and in doing so, they had brought the rest of the galaxy with them. Miller thought back to the day of the battle. He remembered the fear in the eyes of his crew and the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. He realized then that the true power of the Stardestroyer wasn't its weapons or its cloaking device. Its true power was hope. It had given a dying galaxy a reason to believe in a tomorrow. We did a good thing, Varkas, Miller said quietly. Varkas looked at the peaceful ships outside and nodded. Yes, Miller, you did. You saved us from ourselves. And the best part is, the galaxy is finally starting to forget how to fight. That is your greatest victory. For me, as the sun of the Unity system caught the hull of the USS Stardestroyer, the ship sparkled like a diamond. It was no longer a weapon of war, but a symbol of the promise humanity had made to the stars. The war had ended in 50 minutes, but the story of the galaxy was only just beginning, and for the first time in history, the people of the stars were looking forward to seeing what happened next. The long night was over, and the dawn had finally arrived, brought by a small species from a small planet who simply decided that enough was enough. 5 years after the Great Ceasefire, the galaxy faced its first major challenge that didn't come from within. Deep space sensors, maintained by the human-led Galactic Guardians, picked up a signal from beyond the galactic rim. It was a massive, dark, object moving toward the galaxy at incredible speeds. It wasn't a ship, but a living entity, a void eater that consumed the energy of stars. For the first time, the Krell, the Zarn, and the humans had to face an enemy that couldn't be reasoned with or shown images of peace. This was a force of nature that threatened to undo everything they had built. Admiral Miller stood once again on the bridge of the USS Stardestroyer. He felt the familiar hum of the ship, but this time, he wasn't alone in the sector. Flanking him were the Krell's most powerful dreadnoughts and the Zarn's psychic-linked cruisers. They were no longer fighting each other. They were a single wall of defense. "The entity will reach the border in 10 minutes, Sarah reported. Her voice was calm. She had grown from a young officer into a confident commander. "All ships are linked to our targeting grid. We are ready." The Void Eater appeared as a shadow that blocked out the stars. It was hundreds of miles long, a swirling mass of dark matter and hunger. As it approached, the alien captains looked to the Stardestroyer for leadership. Miller didn't hesitate. "We use the same technology that ended the war, but in reverse. Instead of dampening energy, we focus it. Sink all reactors to the Stardestroyer's main core." The alien ships complied instantly. For 70,000 years, they had guarded their secrets. Now, they opened their systems to the humans, trusting them completely. A massive beam of pure white energy shot out from the human ship, amplified by the combined power of the Krell and Zarn fleets. It wasn't a beam of destruction, but a beam of pure, concentrated light, the very thing the Void Eater couldn't stand. The creature shrieked in a frequency that vibrated through the hulls of every ship. It tried to push forward, but the wall of light was too strong. Slowly, the dark entity began to break apart, its energy scattering back into the void from which it came. The threat was gone in minutes. The celebration this time was different. It wasn't just a relief that the fighting had stopped. It was the realization that together, they were invincible. The Krell and Zarn crews cheered for each other over the comms. They had saved their homes together. Miller watched the sensor readings fade. He realized that this was the true final step of the peace process. Nothing brings people together like a common goal. The 50 minutes that ended the war had paved the way for this moment of total unity. The USS Stardestroyer had protected the galaxy once again, but it had done so with the help of its former enemies. Back at the station, Varkas met Miller with a bottle of Earth wine. "I suppose we should thank that monster," Varkas said, pouring a glass. "It gave my soldiers a chance to see that the humans aren't the only ones who can be heroes." Miller smiled. "We were always heroes, Varkas. We just spent too much time being villains to each other. Today, the galaxy didn't see Krell, or Zarn, or humans. They just saw protectors." Varkas raised his glass. "To the protectors, and to the ship that showed us the way." As the 10th anniversary of the Great Ceasefire approached, humanity decided it was time to step back. They didn't want to be the kings of the galaxy forever. They wanted a true galactic republic where every race had an equal vote. Admiral Miller, now nearing retirement, proposed the creation of the Galactic Council. This council would be located on a neutral station, and the humans would give up their control over the peace zone. It was a risky move. Many feared that without the human hammer, the old empires would return to their old ways. The debate in the human government was fierce. "We have worked so hard to bring order," one politician argued. "If we leave, it will all fall apart." But Miller insisted, "If we stay in control, it's not peace. It's an occupation. We have to trust that. They have learned. We have to let them grow up." His words carried the day. The plan was set. The USS Stardestroyer would lead a final parade through the galaxy, visiting the homeworlds of every major race, before being turned into a floating museum at the heart of the new council station. The parade was a journey of memories. Everywhere the Stardestroyer went, it was met with millions of people. In the Krell capital, they threw flowers made of precious metals into the air. In the Zarn hive cities, the collective mind sang a song of gratitude that could be heard for miles. People who had lost limbs or families in the long war came out to see the ship that had stopped the bleeding. Miller stood on the hull of the ship during the final stop, looking out at the crowds. He saw that the hate was truly gone, replaced by a deep, quiet respect. On the final day, Miller handed over the keys of the ship to the first elected council leader, a young Czarn who had been born on the day the war ended. It was a symbolic gesture, but a powerful one. The Stardestroyer, once a weapon of ultimate power, was now a house of law. Its bridge was turned into a meeting room. Its hangars were turned into libraries. The technology that had once been used to jam weapons was now used to translate thousands of languages so that everyone could understand each other. The era of the human policeman was over. The era of the galactic citizen had begun. Miller walked off the ship for the last time, carrying only a small bag of personal items. He looked back at the sleek black hull. He thought about the 50 minutes that had changed 70,000 years. He thought about the lives saved and the futures built. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known his entire life. He was no longer a soldier or an admiral. He was just John Miller, a man from Earth. And as he boarded the small shuttle to take him back to his home planet, he knew that the galaxy was in good hands. The Stardestroyer would keep watching over them, not as a threat, but as a reminder of what happens when people choose to be better. 50 years after the war ended, the name USS Stardestroyer was a legend told to every child in the galaxy. It was the story of the 50 minutes that saved the world. The galaxy was now a place of incredible beauty and harmony. New races were being discovered every year, and they were welcomed with open arms rather than weapons. The Krell and Czarn were now so integrated that their cultures had blended into something new and vibrant. The old war was something found only in history, books, a dark shadow that made the present light seem even brighter. In a small house by a lake on Earth, an old man sat in a rocking chair. It was John Miller. He was very old now, but his eyes were still sharp. He spent his days watching the sky, where the faint lights of starships could sometimes be seen. He didn't have any medals on his wall. He didn't need them. He had a shelf full of letters from people across the galaxy. One was from a Krell child who was now a doctor. Another was from a Czarn artist who had painted a mural of the Earth. These were his true rewards. One evening, a young boy, his great-grandson, came to sit with him. "Grandpa, tell me about the big ship again," the boy said. "Tell me how it stopped the war." Miller smiled and pulled the boy closer. "Well, it wasn't just the ship, Leo. The ship was just a tool. It was the people inside it. We decided that 70,000 years of fighting was enough. We decided that instead of being the best at killing, we would be the best at helping. And once we showed the others that it was possible, they decided the same thing." The boy looked up at the stars. "Do you think there will ever be another war?" Miller was silent for a moment. He looked at the peaceful world around him. "I hope not, Leo. But if there is, I hope there will be someone brave enough to stand up and say stop. I hope there will be someone who remembers that it only takes 50 minutes to change the world if you have enough heart." The boy nodded, satisfied with the answer. They sat there in silence as the sun went down. A man who had ended a war and a child who would never have to know one. The USS Stardestroyer remained at the center of the galaxy, a silent sentinel. It was a monument to the moment humanity reached out and saved its neighbors. It was a reminder that, even in a universe of 70,000 years of hate, 50 minutes of courage can make all the difference. The war was gone, the empires were gone, but the peace remained. And as the stars twinkled in the deep black of space, they seemed to whisper a thank you to the small blue planet that had dared to dream of a better way. The story of the Stardestroyer was over, but the story of the galaxy was just beginning, and it was a story of light,